This presentation is going to examine what it means to develop communities. And that's, of course, an important idea when we start talking about community development. So let's talk about what it is and what it isn't. There's a specific meaning in the field of community development, and it implies that we are hiring an outside change agent of some kind, a specialist, who will assist in a particular way in facilitating some kind of improvement. Not all communities will do this, and therefore, by this definition, not all communities have a community development plan. However, all communities do act, and when a community acts on its own without the aid of development, we simply call that community action. And some communities have a very good ability to solve problems and create the conditions that they want to come into place, and if that's the case, then we say a community has a high level of agency. That is, they've got a good deal of control over local conditions. So let's define development. Community development involves networks of actors engaged in activities through associations in a place, and that's according to the book by Robinson and Green. And the goals are to improve the quality of life and build an all-inclusive and diverse community. And that sounds nice, but it's really hard to pull that off many times, right? If it was easy, there wouldn't be a field of community development. And as we said before, what sets apart community development is the reliance on a change agent or community development practitioner. This effort to develop communities goes back over a century. In the early 20th century, progressives implemented some of the early ideas that we see today in order to address many problems that were conflicting local communities as a result of widespread urbanization. And during this time, of course, there was a massive decline in terms of farming and agriculture, and a growth in cities at the same time, and that created disruptions in both the countryside and the city itself. In the 1960s, there was a resurgence in interest in community development following the civil rights movement, and a lot of the ideas that we associate with the conflict approach to community development grew directly out of that civil rights movement. So the focus of community development and some issues need to be discussed. So generally, there's a broad, holistic, quality of life focus associated with community development. There are a couple exceptions. Talk about the technical assistance approach. At times is more narrowly focused. But generally speaking, community development is a very broad, focused, and holistic plan, right? So it's not equated solely with economic development. In fact, a lot of times community development is pitted against economic development strategies, which tend to look a lot like a growth machine phenomenon, which we've discussed in other places, because of the narrow focus it has that can actually harm the quality of life. So some of the issues that are addressed through community development include poverty, housing, job training, social services, also more recently concerns with the environment, healthcare, and education. And the common thread of community development as a field is a tendency to privilege public solutions, right? And also public participation in decision making, so that the communities actually take ownership of whatever kind of community development plan is developed. An important distinction to understand in community development is the idea of development of the community versus development in the community. And this notion of development of the community is usually tied to this technical assistance approach that we'll talk about, and is primarily focused on the ends or the outcomes rather than the process that creates those outcomes. And by contrast, development in the community tends to promote public participation that is concerned with the means or the process. And it's not that there's complete disregard for the ends or the outcome, but the priority is to ensure a fair and inclusive democratic process. And ideally, we'll have some elements of both, as in fact many community development programs do. Another defining feature of community development is that it does try to use a scientific method to the extent that it's possible. And this is a great quote to capture that idea out of the Robinson and Green textbook on community development. It says, "Community development can be considered a positive science, focusing on identifying the most effective ways to promote development in communities. This view of community development sees the importance of basing local programs on empirical evidence and not just on the desires and preferences of local residents." So while it's important to have a fair and inclusive process, a good change agent or practitioner will help bring some of this evidence to the attention of the local residents and give advice on what may or may not work, right? That doesn't mean necessarily that the change agent gets to prescribe solutions, but the change agent can at least steer the conversation in some important ways. Though we're not going to go into depth, it's worth mentioning what those approaches are to community development, as we've been referring to some of them. And the three main ones are technical assistance, conflict, and self-help. And in fact, most of the other approaches, such as the interactional approach or what's called the appreciative inquiry approach, are some variation of the self-help model. And that's where most of the attention is given. Now, historically and in the beginning, community development was dominated by a technical assistance paradigm, and the conflict approach is what emerged after the civil rights movement, as we noted earlier. So the goal, generally speaking, of community development is building capacity. That's, of course, difficult if you're dealing with a community that's at a great disadvantage, resulting from historical factors, perhaps, and have a very low capacity for self-help. And those are the cases where some kind of conflict approach and maybe some technical assistance can be helpful. But generally speaking, in community development, we want to resist the temptation to just resort to technical assistance, which essentially is playing the role of doctor, right? Assessing the problem, prescribing a solution, and then verifying that the solution worked, and then making tweaks as needed. That's not a good metaphor, generally speaking. It is under certain conditions, as we'll see in another presentation. But generally, the focus should be on building community capacity, which is really the hallmark of self-help and the related approaches of AI and the interactionist approach. And in order to do that, sometimes we have to overcome power imbalances, which is the hallmark of the conflict perspective.